Thank you so much for having me here. I was a grad student back in the day in the audience, like some of you, so it's really fun to be up front. All right, so I'm going to start with a kind of high-level call to action. This is sort of like a kind of inspirational talk, if you will. I'm going to give you like a wild tour through a lot of the work we do. But I wanted to read you a couple of quotes from sort of pundits in academia and also in industry. So here's Tristan Harris. We're training and conditioning a whole new generation of people that when we're uncomfortable or lonely or uncertain or afraid, we have a digital pacifier for ourselves that's kind of atrophying our own ability to deal with that. And for those of you who don't know who he used to be a design ethicist at Google, and now he runs this place called the Center for Humane Technology. And that's actually a quote from the movie The Social Dilemma, which maybe some of you have seen on Netflix, which is sort of a dystopian take on what social media is doing. Here's a couple of quotes from Sherry Turkle. She is an academic at MIT. This is from Reclaiming Conversation. Intelligence once meant more than what any artificial intelligence does. It used to include sensibility, sensitivity, awareness, discernment, reason, acumen, and wit. And then another quote from a different book of hers, Alone Together. These days, insecure in our relationships and anxious about intimacy, we look to technology for ways to be in relationships and protect ourselves from them at the same time. So I want to be clear that I am not a Luddite. Okay, I don't want us all to go back to running through the fields and talking with tin cans. And, you know, I know like I'm no longer a super young person, so I just want you to know this critique is not coming from a kind of Luddite point of view. But I do think that technology has sort of slid into this sinkhole of sucking our individual attention into screens and kind of proliferating these opportunities for us to kind of fall down these rabbit holes. And sometimes those rabbit holes lead to the illusion that we're having rich, meaningful connection with each other, when we climb up out of them, we realize, wow, there's something missing in this. It's not as rich as it could be. I'm not even sure what's wrong, but something's going on. And I care about this, so I have worked in industry. I've worked in design firms. I worked at a startup at one point. And I'm in academia now, and my perspective on what we can do in the academy is that we can take the long view. We can consciously choose to chart a different course, if we like, from situations we see unfolding in technology. So there are other people here at Stanford who do that kind of thing. One person that comes to mind for me is Michael Bernstein, who's a faculty member in this program, who is, really taken sort of society and ethics, bull by the horns, and thinking about his own work in social computing. So I think especially engineering schools, we exist at this really interesting intersection between practicality in the world of making things that are going to go out and affect potentially millions of people, but also doing basic research that can subtly shift the course of where we all go. And I think it's important to reflect on that and think about what we can do, what our positionality is basically in affecting the future of technology. And that's basically what this talk is about in some sense. So of course, there are a lot of different ways to do that. So sometimes technologists also get involved in policy and advising. However, at least for me, the primary tools of my trade of influencing the direction of where things go are a combination of building technological prototypes of possible futures and also distilling out lessons from building those prototypes and testing them out with real people to create tools for thought for other people, not just in research, but also out in industry. Now I use the P word, I use the play word. I know Christina has bought into that. I'm going to introduce some tools for thought today, and I include play in the mix. And I know that for some people, I think this country in particular still has this kind of Puritan work ethic background, and there's sometimes a suspicion of games and play as maybe like a waste of time, maybe something sidelined or smaller than serious, weighty problems of the world. And I hope part of what will happen in this talk is you'll see how play has become an important through line for me in understanding the future of where technology could go in a different way. This is my lab group. This is a failed kayaking expedition we took as a field trip. There's this place, Elkhorn Slough, which is south of Santa Cruz. It was so windy that day that we basically paddled around in the harbor, and then they brought us back because they were scared to take us into the slough. So that was kind of funny. We build stuff. Now, we don't build stuff on the level of, say, a Sean Fulmer, where we're like hardcore engineering new ground-up technologies. What we do is we take near-term stuff that's gotten stable enough that we can hack together interesting visions of how the future might be that people can actually play with. And we obviously, we publish in places. That was a poster at Chi. But we also show things. This is the Exploratorium. So we demo our stuff at like science museums. I've shown stuff in art exhibitions. Like we found that actually getting things to a resolution that's high enough for everyday public to interact with teaches us additional lessons. And you've already seen the books. I should say before I was at UC Santa Cruz, I was actually at NYU, where I had a joint position between computer science and the Game Center. So I was actually in two totally different schools at the university, and that was definitely very interesting. I mentioned already that I worked in industry for a while. It's been a while since I did that, but I have a feel for how all that works. And I write these books. Oh, and ACM has decided I'm a distinguished scientist. So that's the one other little bit of street cred. Okay. So let's begin with a tool that helped me to think more creatively about how we got where we are now. Y'all familiar with this image? It's a little optical illusion. What do we see? Anybody can answer. What do you see?
A vase.
You see a vase. Okay, that's like me. We're going to talk more about that. What's the other thing you see? Two faces. My core argument in my last several years of work is we're too fixated on the two faces, and we're not fixated enough on the contours of the space between people when we design our technology. So I wrote this little paper. I'm glad to share it with Christina, and she can propagate it out. There was this really interesting symposium called Halfway to the Future, where we read a bunch of core papers in HCI from early on, and then we all reflected on where we had gone. And I wrote this piece saying somewhere we took this crazy detour and we got a little lost in highly individualistic technology. And, you know, anybody know who Donna Haraway is? She's this like old school media theorist, like basically a goddess of UC Santa Cruz. And she wrote this book called The Cyborg Manifesto, in which she did these juxtapositions to help people notice their blind spots in their thinking. And I thought, you know what if I juxtapose? What if I start like trying to tease apart what is this creepy thing I think has been happening with technology? I was like, it's too isolating. It's too individualistic. This is bugging me. But what if I flip that? What if it's the opposite? So I'm gonna set up this juxtaposition for you. So right now, we have this value that the device is there to support me at my convenience and serve information perfectly adapted to me. It's kind of like my perfect companion, right? We just take that for granted. But what if devices were there to support us, to support the space between us collectively toward a shared experience? What was that? What if that was the primary driving value you took when you designed something? Also, the device can ask for as much of my attention as it wants at any time. It can make me stare at it and touch it and ignore others. It's like a horrible, spoiled like pet or something. I mean, it's kind of awful if you start thinking of it that way. But what if devices were deeply sensitive to not interrupting and rather enhancing my experience with other people around me and actually was able to avoid those eruptions? What if their signaling and input, these devices didn't get in the way? Maybe it even added something to my social experience. Is that too much to ask? Maybe it's not, right? Right now we have this thing, like devices are like tribbles. They're just more and more and more and more of them. And everybody, buy more, buy more, buy more. So more devices is better. Everybody needs their own, and each person should have all the functionality. Like nobody should, but think of like old technology like an Apple press or a cotton gin. People would like come from miles to use this device. They would form relationships. They would learn about things they could help each other with. What if sharing devices was fine and maybe even to be desired? Because it's powerful to have interdependent and distinct and unique things sometimes. So what if we operated with that assumption? And then the last one is, this is especially most recently, there's this hidden assumption, It's always okay for my device to collect data about me toward forming aggregate patterns to sell better stuff to me as an individual or to other individuals like me, wherever they are, at some future time. But what if we said, no, our devices should only use data they collect about us to improve our co-present experience right here in the here and now, right? Not to say to like rigorously stick to these, but to set up this juxtaposition to help you see kind of the way I was trying to explode out this design space. Yeah?
How about improving your experience in the future?
That would be fine too, I think, but it's sort of like, this is a sidebar, but I personally think a lot of what's messing with human relations right now is the weird, endless presence of things people say. If you think of Twitter, so there's a way, and I saw this great piece. Ezra Klein interviewed this woman who was very astute in her use of different media forms. She said she would only have complex arguments on podcasts because it's a lot harder to strip out and reflect words. You can do it, but it takes more effort and people are lazy, so they'd rather retweet a tweet. So it's a good question, but I think it's a subtle question, right? So, all right. So I'm going to show you two research through lines to give you examples of how taking those juxtapositions into account shapes the kind of work we do and how we think about what we're trying to do in the world, and kind of show you how that evolves and ends up providing tools for thought as well. And I should say right now, the approach we take in our lab, I already said we're tinkerers. We build things with other people's stuff. We take what is called a research through design approach. So we believe very much in knowledge being produced through bottom-up making, that we learn as we go, but we also believe in the importance of abstracting knowledge that makes it easier to share. So a lot of times we end up with what is called mid-range theory that we're sharing in papers like strong concepts, or sometimes we show a portfolio of our work and we do what's called an annotated portfolio, but I just want you to understand the kind of work we do. All right. And then I wanted to say one more thing about why play. So probably those of you who have taken a games class know about the magic circle that Huizinga talked about, which is that when we engage in a play situation with others, we agree to step a little bit outside of ourselves and to accept a different reality consensually and together for a little bit. And I think this is a really nice way of thinking about shaping different socio-technical configurations, even if you're not explicitly designing a game. And I think it's a very valuable place to look for, because when we design a new social technology, we have to get people to take it up, and we have to understand what it's like when they take it up. You know, I think a classic example would be Google Glass. They did this thing where you had to apply to get one, and they distributed them really broadly across lots of random people all over. They didn't create little pockets of kind of power quirky users of Glass to help them understand bottom up what was going to happen. They weren't thinking of the social space around the technology. So I think thinking about games and play helps us to design this whole nexus of things. And I have a paper about that from a couple of years ago at Chi. And all along, I will be signposting papers, and I will share these slides so you can always track them down later. Okay, so the first strand of work I'm going to talk about is our social wearables work. So when we got into this, you know, I don't mind Fitbits. This is just, you know, being a little dramatic here. But most of the commercially successful wearables were like, oh, I'm tracking all this data about me. How many steps have I taken? Or how many steps have you taken? And that's how we're engaging, right? Or nowadays, with the Apple Watch and other similar things, it's like you can pick up phone or text messages, right? But it's sort of social media stuff. So we're like, what if we played around with social wearables and thought about these social values? Could we come up with a really different design space around this stuff? So as I said, before I was at UC Santa Cruz, I was actually at NYU, and part of my joint appointment was in the Game Center. And I had met people who were into LARP. LARP stands for live action role play. Who here does not know what LARP is? Okay, a couple of people. So this is it's not like theater because there's no audience. It's more like a game of D&D where somebody's like the dungeon master, there are LARP designers, and they facilitate a shared experience, and people come together, they get a character, they're improvising, but there are also these plot points and these kind of emotional buildups. So I knew about LARP, and I was really fascinated by this community. One of the cool things about them is they're very particular about how they use technology. So we actually did this paper for FDG a few years ago, like as foundational work before we got into this design phase. And one of the things about LARP is they will not use a technology that distracts people. No phones, no watches. Like, they will only use a technology, and here's some pictures from this survey we did about different technology. They will custom build really elaborate, wonderful things, but they have to support the group experience of being in this interesting story world. So we went through 2 cycles of co-design with LARP designers and then deploying devices in their LARPs. And in doing that, we got a lot of rich information from them about like what affordances of technology work socially, like what do they signal to other people, how do they work with a person as they're very engaged in a narrative situation. I'm going to show you a little video about one of those pieces. This was the second in the cycle. This was, so when I first moved to UC Santa Cruz, I was like, I saw the campus. I don't know if you've seen it. It's like redwood trees and huge meadows, and I had this fantasy of people running around with technology in the woods. I was like, I'm gonna like make a LARP thing here. You know, it was just like one of those first thoughts as a researcher. So I was like, yes. So we found this group, Event Horizon, and they actually ran LARPs, not on our campus, but they ran LARPs in the Marin Headlands, okay? They like had this cool facility and these multi-day LARPs. One problem is they didn't have any network access, so that made co-design interesting. But they were like a perfect test case for playing around with what could a social wearable be if it was fitted into the story world and it was doing something for not just the one person but the whole group. So we worked with them to co-design this wearable, and then we deployed it in this LARP. So I'll play you this video that my student made about it.
In 2018, we co-designed a social wearable with a team of LARP designers. The device affords a variety of interactions. For example, expressive ones. You can change the color displayed or create brightness patterns. The device also affords competitive behaviors. You can stun people.
Obviously, just pretend.
And people can put you into a state of overload by entering a code on your back. In the game narrative, when you are overloaded, you are limited in motion and action. In fact, the device makes you vulnerable as it gets into overload automatically every now and then. And since the wearable makes you vulnerable, people can come and help you. They can pat your back to help your overload go by faster, or enter another code on your back to remove it instantly. They can also enter a very special code that will make you immune to overloads altogether. Our wearable affords a variety of interactions, both expressive, competitive, and friendly ones. We deployed 15 copies of the wearable in a 4-weekend LARP event. 109 people participated. We collected data by enacting researcher characters in the game, and we found something very interesting. People were very excited about the vulnerability afforded by the wearable. It encouraged people to care for one another. It made new opportunities for social interactions. That made us think, what if we design technology that makes us vulnerable? We feel we just scratched the surface of a really exciting opportunity, and we can't wait to continue exploring it.
So contrast that with the Fitbit, right? Okay, so there's 3 classes of people in this LARP. The people who got these wearables were called augments, and they were not cyborgs, they were not humans, but they were augmented humans, okay? What was interesting is there was an economy in the game, and there was supposed to be these like wearable technicians. You'd have to pay them to get you out of overload. No money changed hands. people loved helping the person in the overload. Nobody stunned anybody else. Nobody did anything sneaky. The thing they loved about this device was when someone overloaded and they could go help them. It became this like centerpiece of the interactions between people. And like to me, that puts a very different data point into the space of what we could be doing with technology that's worn on the body. Now, vulnerability obviously comes with risk. LARPers have this wonderful thing they do. First of all, they allow people to set boundaries when they come into a LARP. I could be touched or I could not be touched. So they have really elaborate safety protocols for people. And also, they always have a debrief together where they all talk about how it went and any of what they call bleed, where there were strong emotions that came up. So obviously, you don't get off the hook for developing this whole socio-technical apparatus around making people vulnerable. But we're brave and intrepid technology designers. We shouldn't shy away from that, right? Like, to me, this says there's a really interesting direction to go in. Let me just, hey, stop that. Google Slides. No, I went one too far. Hang on. Okay, so you might be like, yeah, those LARPers, they'll do that. Nobody else is going to do that. So we started playing around with how we could pull this out of the LARP situation. And my same student came up with this. This is a Swedish word, actually, and it should have a little circle over the O. I could not figure out how to get that character. I'm very sorry if anyone here is Swedish. Lagom is this concept of everybody being kind of equal and in balance. So we had actually a postdoc. She's actually from Spain, but she had gotten her PhD in Sweden, so that's how we named it Lagom. But anyway, so they created this. So this is like, it looks like the clown flower that shoots water out, you know, on a clown costume, except for that's a gooseneck mic, and it's a little processor. I think it's an Adafruit component. Anyway, we've switched so much I can't even remember which one it is. But anyway, so it has simple haptic vibratory motor, and it also has little LEDs that can light up. So this is a consensual conversational balance tool. And the backstory is these little flowers, they need nourishment of human voice, but they need it in moderation. You know how you can kill a plant with too much water or not enough water? So everybody turns them on at once, and then as you're speaking, it's keeping track of how much you speak. If you don't speak at all, it'll start to give you a little gentle vibration. Or if you speak for a really long time, it might also do that. And then when everybody's decided they're stopped talking, they can all push another button at once, and they all see what proportion of the conversation they took up. So this is an attempt to kind of offer people like consensual visualization that combines like personal signaling, but also mutually visible signaling, to explore whether a wearable could work in this way for people. Now, obviously, there are lots of little details to work out about this. If somebody's like me, I'm blathering, but I'm like supposed to blather for you, so it would be really out of balance. So, you know, there's a lot of nuances to work on with something like this. Interestingly, people who didn't speak up a lot kind of liked this. They liked getting a little gentle, silent, haptic vibration that nobody else saw. Hey, you could actually speak up. So that was kind of an interesting finding. This was just like a late-breaking work, so we didn't do a big study about this. More recently, this same student did this really interesting project. She actually had high school interns in our lab for the summer, and they were playing around with these little lightweight processors, and like, you know, like, we're all sitting at our desks too much. Wouldn't it be cool, similar to the flowers who need conversational water, wouldn't it be cool if we could make these little bugs that like tie onto your shoe, and they actually need proximity to each other. So like if one of them gets a little bit down, you have to like get off your butt and go find someone else who has one of these little guys, right? And so interestingly, so this is like a late breaking work type thing, and this sort of shows you the dynamic. So you're just sitting there. Periodically, they go off, basically, and they need to connect with others. If they don't get to connect, they're kind of going to get more frantic. And like, oh, please help me. But they do this only through vibration and light, so it's not super intrusive to you. So in building these, my student actually, this is one of those examples of extracting out kind of mid-range theory. She was like, you know, we don't really think, and this kind of goes along with HCI there's a strand of HCI that's trying to move away from like user-centered design to maybe like being-centered design, like thinking about not just people, but like others and maybe the ecosystem, et cetera. She was like, we don't really have working concepts in HCI for the interplay between the technology and groups of people that could kind of drive people to engage in certain ways. And in this case, the shoe flies are kind of like the bad cop because they need a break and they need connection. And they drag you along, you know? And so you find you're interacting with other people more, but you don't feel embarrassed about it because it's just like this weird thing, and you're supposed to take care of this shoe fly. She was like, we should really think about this idea of synergistic social technologies. Like, what if part of designing the space between people was thinking about how technologies could help us to balance and help us to come into communication with one another, but in very gentle, very respectful, maybe even playful ways, right? Because that device, obviously, if you were to wear one, it's kind of a consensual, okay, I'll go along with this. You know, I don't think these types of things should be used draconianly or in a required manner. Things could get twisted in that way. But if people always talk about how they need to be reminded to take breaks, get out to lunch, et cetera, et cetera. If we were thoughtful about core concepts that could help us, give us design tools to then build things that people could build into their lives. This is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So, if we go back to this suprahuman, the idea of like the space between, then we could say, well, these devices, this line of devices, they are there to support us. It's not about my little information stockpile. It's about, I've decided I want to have good interactions with other people, and I'm going to use this technology to scaffold that in creative ways. I would also argue that there's a sensitivity there, in some cases more than others, but at least a design awareness of the cost of interruption and balancing interruption with opportunity, with social opportunity. Sharing devices, I mean, True Colors gets at that a little bit. Maybe that one we don't hit so much. And then we really have just used this localized data to drive these interactions. So we're not using extractive data to make these projects run. Okay. So like that's like no screens at all. It's unfair to show this picture. This is actually a super cool project, but I freaking love this image. This is actually people on their own in separate VR experiences, and the technology is automatically directing them not to run into each other. It's super cool, but it's not. But what I think is funny about this is that you know everybody's in their hermetically sealed world, and so you might say to yourself, oh, wearables, you know, that's an easy one because like you took away the screen. Nobody can focus on that. Of course they're focusing on each other. So now I'm going to show you diving all the way into the screen in virtual reality, which, by the way, I was a total VR skeptic. I hated VR, and I was curmudgeonly about it, and I thought it was like kind of gross and creepy. But as often happens, a very talented and bright young person came to me, whose name is Joshua McVeigh-Schultz, who became my postdoc and is now a professor at SF State, and he's like, no, you've got it all wrong. Like, VR can be really cool, really amazing. It just needs good design attention. He's like, this is a potentially transformative medium. I'm like, okay, I will work with you on this. So we set out to do a project together, which first started in getting him funded. So as a professor, you're always chasing funding. So we got him a one-year postdoc from Mozilla. And then more recently, we got National Science Foundation money, which I think was helped by the fact that the pandemic threw us all onto Zoom, right? So suddenly it became even more desirable to figure out some other way of gathering virtually than screens and like looking like whatever, Family Feud, Brady Bunch, whatever metaphor you want to use. Okay. So I want to make a nod to the long history around VR and even pre-VR collaborative virtual environments. Like, people have been designing these spaces for a long time. Weirdly, often extremely badly. So I was meeting with somebody before this talk, and they were asking me, like, how did you get into games? And then why are you doing the stuff you're doing now after games? And part of my motivation was, like, early collaborative virtual environments, it was kind of like floating corpses. There'd be like these like weird floating corpses, and they'd have no facial expression, and like they'd just show up at coordinates, and like you couldn't even find your way. It was so bizarre. But you know who was doing immersive, multi-person online worlds really well? Games. They actually figured out a lot of really interesting things about that. So However, it's good to learn from all this early work, and these guys had really astute things to say. So first we did our homework of learning what came before us. And then we said, hey, there's this nascent space. Tons of interesting new apps, and this was a few years ago now. We're like artsy spaces like Anyland, and then like Facebook Spaces at that time. Like lots of different players were starting to get into trying to support social VR. So we're like, let's actually interview designers and developers who are working in that world, and let's ask them, what do you do to make a space friendly, to make a space supportive for people? So we did this interviews with experts project, and there were actually 2 papers that came out of this. One kind of the general ideas, and the one my student Anya was really focusing in on avatars and how we think about avatars. So there were a lot of things we learned. This is kind of one of those smorgasbord talks, and I want to leave time for Q&A, so I'm not going to get hardcore into all of it. I'll give you just a couple of examples. So one thing we learned is people tout full embodiment in VR, but we all know that's not true. We're only now starting to get facial tracking. Like there's a lot of social signals that aren't in there. So there's a lot of really interesting control schemas for how to reintroduce things like emotional signaling. So like Rec Room had these little flicks of the wrist that could make your face change. They were trying to make it as intuitive as possible, kind of like puppeting your face. And then a lot of them were just using emoji, because emoji had already propagated elsewhere. And so that created interesting effects like this. This is actually from a Reggie Watts live concert. So for those of you who actually participate in stuff like Twitch streaming, like any kind of live streaming situation, people were already used to kind of flinging emoji. And so people fling emoji in VR too, and they have a lot of fun with it. And then also, and this gets back to the sort of old school virtual environments research, obviously it makes sense. A lot of things from real life we drag into VR spaces, and our expectations are set that way. So the Rec Room people talked about how when they first started Rec Room, they needed to have a place for people to gather. And the avatars would just mill around, and it was chaos. So they essentially reinvented this. They were like, hey, wait. People have these social norms. Like if you give them like an auditorium seating and you give them a way to sit and orient, they'll just kind of do that. So they started to recreate these place and space metaphors in VR. However, and this was kind of a clue to where we decided we want to go. You see this like cat up in the top left? So there was still the problem of like who was speaking. And in fact, that's the problem. If you ever go to a conference and they're using an audio system and you have to step up to the mic, if a mic gets passed around, you can't tell. There's no spatialization because it's just coming out of speakers. So like, let's make a giant cat. And it will be looking at the mic. So they pass around a virtual mic, and you can always tell who's speaking because you just follow the gaze of the cat. Like, that is profound, my friends. That is like, you can't, I mean, how much work would it be to make a giant robotic cat in this room? It would be ridiculous. We wouldn't do it. In VR, it's so easy. There are just these very different affordances for what can readily be done. And that little maneuver heightened the social experience for people and made it playful and kind of solved a problem. So that's just like a couple of little insights from the interviews. There's lots of other stuff in the paper. Yeah?
What do you feel about like people doing socially inappropriate things in VR nowadays?
Yeah, I think that harassment and weird social behavior is a huge issue. In fact, one of my students got harassed almost immediately when we started doing the next thing is we did this self-study of spaces, and you have to learn very quickly how to protect yourself. Like people get into your body space or harass. This is a problem on all kind of anonymized platforms, not just VR. I think it's something that needs to be designed around. I think one of the things that we saw, I think it was Rec Room, if you put your hand up, you would just create the space around yourself. So one thing is I think you have to think about what do people normally do when they protect themselves, and just like make that thing work right away so it's gonna work for a novice, because that's one of the biggest problems is like these harassers camp on the novice spawning spots. Our work took a turn where we decided to focus on augmenting meetings between people who already knew each other, because we saw that was a little bit less explored and kind of an interesting terrain. So I haven't done a ton of work on design mechanics, but it's a super important design space. Agree. Okay. Oh yeah, in the back.
This is a later conversation, really, but I also live in Santa Cruz, and I go to the Lighthouse Park
Yeah.
with my dog regularly. And the dynamics you keep bringing up, the shoe fly or even cat, there's this kind of pet interface
Yes.
that's being virtualized.
Yes.
And it's kind of useful sometimes. You know, my wife's a cat person, I'm a dog person, and she's like, they poop and they fight and
Yeah.
harass, like
Yeah.
all these things. And it requires more vigilance, especially if you like doing dryland mushing or
Yes.
imagine like complicated
Yes.
things with dogs.
Yeah.
But it is like a dog technology versus cat technology. We're talking about isolating with a comforting thing versus going out and like banging into things, and it requires you to train it or it doesn't work. Like it's effortless to get into fights.
Yeah.
But if you do it well,
Yeah.
so what I would love is to study the dynamics of how people treat with dog, like the dog is a technology being trapped.
Yes.
Because everything you can think of.
Yeah.
that
Well,
you've
and
been
this
talking about in terms of
actually.
the dog park.
It came up
Yeah.
in our musings, so as we turn to
Yeah.
virtual meeting rooms,
Yeah.
why are there no meandering pets in meetings? Why? Because it's so great. You take a break, you pet the pet, you remark on the pet doing weird stuff. How many kitten pictures circle around? So I'm with you there.
Adults make friends with their kids.
Yeah, they're a proxy. They're like a familiar, and it's like a face-saving mechanism because you can always back off from it. But these are the subtleties of human interaction that we should be designing to support, in my opinion.
If you find a student who's interested in that, I would love to help you and put devices on.
Let's
dogs'
talk
people.
after the talk, for sure. All right, so we narrowed it down to meeting space. We're like, we're gonna like fix meetings. They're not gonna be in Zoom anymore. These are the meeting spaces we decided to investigate. And first we went through rather casually, and then we kind of, in the interest of getting the work published, which we're still struggling with, we became more rigorous in our like process of checking out the space. We went back through all of them. We had a checklist of things we did and a survey we all filled out after. And we literally tried to have our stand-up, okay, we're just gonna like meet, and so we would have one person be the host, and they would have to make sure everybody had the links. They would set up the Google Doc if you could put it in, and we like ate our own dog food and just tried to see how it worked. Again, like not a ton of time, but I'll give you a couple of highlights, and hopefully this paper will see the light of day in the next year, and then I can send it to Christina. Interesting thing that we noticed was the business-focused ones. They had a lot more of these like kind of horrible pseudo-businessy avatars. Sometimes they had like zombie arms, like really like, they were really focused on business-ishness without a lot of depth to what that might mean to individuals. It was kind of strange. Whereas the more kind of consumery places, such a plethora of beautiful and fast, like you could be a pizza. And we're like, I want to be a pizza in a faculty meeting. I don't want to be a zombie Barbie. Like what? So like that was interesting. And also meeting environments. So a lot of the startups and even the more established companies, they're working really hard to create these like official businessy, whiteboard, markers, like, big conference table kind of environments. But if you look at the more consumery places where you can invite your friends to a meeting, all kinds of crazy spaces and places. Some have hybrid, like GlueVR actually had this wonderful world. So we were having our meeting and then somebody said, ooh, there's this island world. Let's go over there for a little while. So we went over there and then there was this water. We're like, ooh, can we get in the water? Or is it just like, like a skybox? No, it was interactable water. So then we got in the water. You could talk to each other underwater, and the people above water could not hear you. So they were like, blah, 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 blah. But you know what? It was kind of bad for a business meeting. So like you have to really think about how distracting you want your environment to be. But anyway, I think one of the things we took away from this is kind of the cat is not bad, and that we wanted to go more creative in the kinds of things we were going to implement. So I kind of pointed out this chasing realism thing that's going on. And my collaborator, Josh, really inspired by this very early paper by Holland and Stornetta that's like, hey, we should be looking for new kinds of communicative affordances rather than imitating the mechanisms of face-to-face. So he actually led the writing of this whole alt-Chi, the case for weird social in VR that was at Chi last year, so I highly recommend you to read that. So with the remaining time, I'm just going to briefly show you some of our prototypes. Some of this started at USC when he was still a grad student. So things like showing where gaze was going, like actually visualizing gaze. And then we've been playing around. We kind of took the stuff from the wearables, and we've been playing around with conversation balance. So we came up with this idea of these. I think there's a better picture in the next. No. OK, yeah. This is a prototype from USC. It was like, what if like these color balls came out of your mouth when you were talking, and like everything would pile up in this like sandbox, right? Like what might that be like? And then one of my students kind of made that a little bit more buttoned down. It was like, well, like it's hard to spawn all those balls in a true network situation. Like the latency goes up and it's kind of a disaster. So he came up with this column that would slowly disappear the balls over time, and actually did his master's thesis on this. Then, with this more recent NSF-funded project, we retooled his design further. And now it is, so we ported it from Unity to Mozilla, and now it's these, what do you call that, cylinders, that you're talking and a cylinder stretches itself above you and kind of pinches off when you stop talking. And so this doesn't take nearly as much like resource, but you can actually step back as an avatar and you can kind of see the overall flow of the conversation if you just look up into the air. It's kind of like little talk balloons, you know. So we've been running kind of studies where we're comparing, well, how does that affect people's dynamics when they have this versus when they don't? That's just one example. We're doing a lot of other kind of crazy, more far out stuff that isn't really ready to show. This is actually going to be demoed at Kai in the interactivity this year. So if you're there, you can put on one of our Quest 2s and you can try it out. All right. Oh, and here's like an animated GIF. So we set up the desert survival problem. Some of you may know what that is. You pretend you crashed in the desert. There are 12 items you have, and then you have to discuss how to rank the items. So we created this little ranking tray, so people work together to like rank them from 1 to 12. And then we look at how does having this visualization influence their balance of conversation and all kinds of other variables. All right, so circling back to the whole Suprahuman thing. So you could think of VR as a collective atmosphere. That was my student Josh, or my postdoc's profound observation, and this is true of games, collaborative games in general. They are often about the space between people. And so if you start to think that way, then you can create all these strange little ephemeral or kind of playful affordances that facilitate the coming together. And when people come into a shared space, they are in some sense stepping into the magic circle, and strange things may happen in VR. So it opens up a really interesting terrain for being quite creative about how to support things like making sure your conversation is in balance. All right, so I am running out of time, but hopefully these prototypes and kind of the thinking behind them shows you how we are working on reshaping social technology. And by showing you things that are distributed on the body versus things where you're full on immersed, I want you to lift those ideas off of specific technologies and be thinking of them in a more general fashion. I want to also add that I think it's really important, the interface with industry. So my student who did all the social wearables work did a summer internship at Snap. And she worked on augmented reality lenses that were highly social and like intergenerational and super playful. And there's actually a paper at CSCW about that. And then I didn't even get into our human-food interaction stuff. So we actually got money from Google's well-being team to like unpack family mealtime. And like, how could tech not be distracting? So they're taking the bull by the horns. So I'm not like a critical theorist. I actually want to shift where we're going with everyday practice. And I had friends who were in this when I was in grad school here. This is like this cardboard bicycle exercise. It's like a hardcore engineering class, but like you build this crazy thing and then you have to actually ride these bikes. Like, I just think play is so integral to us solving this problem, but it's also integral to the process that we should have as technologists. We shouldn't be afraid to play and to think about the texture of experience, including playfulness, and getting ourselves out of this kind of like hole we've gotten into. I just think it's a temporary hole. We have to dig ourselves out of the hole and get somewhere else. So let's make tag for the space between us. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for speaking. I guess my question is, with the decline of like social interaction and intimacy in society,
Yeah.
how do you feel about kind of like the consequent rise in like virtual companions, like that are 100% like artificial, like whether that be like romantic partners or pets or friends?
Yeah, yeah. So actually, in this book, I wrote a little bit about that with Japanese dating simulators. And I think, gosh, I love science fiction. Like, I love Philip K. Dick. He reflects on this. I think technology and media, they can help us more deeply understand ourselves. They could be a portal to awareness. But I also think that machines, including machines imbued with machine learning, they're not, like the fellow in the back was talking about pets, right? When you build a robotic pet, you kind of dumb down the model of petness. You take away a lot of the friction and resistance and individuality of the pet, the things that are a pain in the neck, but that perversely make us care more. So I question the seamlessness of those interactions. I think if you were to look at my juxtaposition of individualistic versus collective technology, by taking away the friction, the effort, the kind of surprising sort of connection out of care that happens between actual like biological beings, doesn't have to be human and human, right? I think that you take something essential out of it. Like if you look at people who retire, for example, like older humans, if they're not taking care of things, if they don't have a role that provides them with some friction, often they don't do as well. So I think that's a problem point. I mean, can you solve that? I don't know. But that's a place where I'm a little skeptical. Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a question about your work in VR and meetings. I used Mozilla Hubs for meetings before, and one of the issues we had was that the lack of body language, the lack of ability to facial expression.
Yes.
You showed kind of some approaches people are taking with emojis and things, but that's not really real time.
Yeah.
Have you done any like more?
Well, we're super close to having facial expression.
Oh wow.
Like one of the students Josh is working with, there's some actually, I think it's openly available thing he's porting into Hubs right now. So I actually think the industry is about to solve that problem. And I think facial expression is a weird one because it's a combination of involuntary and voluntary signaling. So things like emojis can work with the voluntary side, but it's the involuntary side. Now, however, why we're not using neck movement more is beyond me. Like Disney, there's this great book, The Illusion of Life, by some Disney animators, and they talk about how the neck is the essential place in animation, and we have the degrees of freedom to know when somebody's avoiding or approaching something. So we could heighten that, right? That would be a place where you could probably get a lot of juiciness emotionally. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge spot. Agree. Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the shoe fly and logical technologies, this idea of prompted social interaction.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any danger of encouraging inauthentic or unnatural social interactions and expressions through that, where someone, gets this prompt to do something and they say, okay, I'm going to go do this to like check a box rather than actually doing what they may naturally or having this authentic expression?
Well, I mean, okay, so I think that gets to the age-old argument in games of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Really good game design works with people's intrinsic motivation. I chose to step into that magic circle because I'm up for it. Should you be able to shut your little shoe fly up? Of course you should. Like, it should never be a death march to socializing. Do you know what I'm saying? That's why I was careful to say no corporate shoe fly distribution. Like, it needs to be a consensual, but however, people make frames. Like, think of like folk games like egg and spoon races. It's like, people are always making frames for socialization that help newcomers jump right in, that people with different capacities can do. So we already do this all the time. We're just not used to thinking of it in association with technology, I think. It's just kind of like a strange mix of flavors, maybe. Yes?
We have a question on Zoom.
Okay.
You're unmuted now.
Ooh.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm kind of actually looking at social VR kind of as a sort of successor to games like Facade. It's a video game where, you are trying to deal with the relationship between these two, lovers, married people named Trip and Grace.
Yeah.
And do you think that including those kinds of, say, interactions and, having some sort of person in GPT-3 to chat with, kind of as an additional participant, would help improve like the social VR experience?
Well, it's possible, but I've been on the virtual human quest my whole career, and I think we're nowhere near. So a colleague designed that game. Michael Mateus is one of the designers of that game. And I have to tell you, when I played that game, I got so irritated with Trip and Grace after 5 minutes that I just left. I was like, you are neurotic freaks. I would never have dinner with you. I'm done. So like, I kind of have a high bar for virtual humans. So that's why I think pets might be good to aim for. Or like, actually, like we built this little haptic robot thing that's like a little anxious creature that you pet to calm down. I think there's a lot of room for like, not exactly anthropomorphic, but like being very measured in your objectives with the being that's introduced. It could be fireflies. What if you had fireflies in VR? And what if like when people smiled, they got a little brighter and they like floated a little higher? I mean, I'm just saying, like, it doesn't have to be literally another, like a humanoid thing. You've got to animate, you've got to have a whole mental model, it's got to keep track of everything it said to you. That's super heavyweight, and I'm not even sure how much you get from it. Yeah.
Is that, Matthias game, is that automatically generated narrative?
It's procedural narrative, yeah. Yeah, and I don't know exactly like the total underlying mechanics, but yes, that it was basically like an exemplar, a built exemplar of procedural narrative. Yeah.
It's in VR?
No, it's just like a downloadable. Yeah.
I have a hot take. I don't believe in VR.
Okay.
The reason is because I feel like there's a high entry barrier to getting a device itself.
Yeah.
And I feel like people who are poorer, especially from low income countries or less developed countries, wouldn't have this opportunity to learn VR. That's why I don't believe in it.
I get that. However, phones completely jumped landlines and much faster in developing countries. And things like the Quest 2 are like not that far off from a slightly augmented phone. So I think you're right now, but that might not be true in a few years, So, but that's fair, and that's a good question to ask of any technology. Do we even need it at all, and who is using it, who has access to it? Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I also really like ideas of like social wearables as well as like the hardware stuff.
Yeah.
I'm kind of concerned about developing these because a very strong reason why phones and laptops are so popular is because with one piece of hardware you run thousands and thousands of softwares and thousands of tasks.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of concerned about just like the environmentalism behind this with the costs and the materials behind like getting these hardware built and then like Apple comes out with a new device every few years. Like these hardware will be updated again and again. And I'm just really worried about like the
proliferation of No, I agree. I feel you on that. I mean, most of the things we made are with little DIY processors that can be repurposed into other things. And in fact, we repurpose them when we go on to build different prototypes. So I think you could imagine a model in which there is some kind of standard where there's a little processor and then there's little tools, like kind of like going to a sewing store, right? Where you're thinking about the modularity and the longevity. But I think that's a deeper issue in technology, which gets into kind of the forced obsolescence and the inability to decompose something into parts that can be reused. And I'm very sympathetic to that perspective, and I agree. I certainly don't want to cause a proliferation of more and more of this stuff. Yeah.
Like in the future, how do people like distribute their times between like in the real world and in like VR environments? Like how long would they spend in VR? What type of things would they do in VR?
Yeah. I mean, so like one thing I realized when we all went on Zoom is that I've already been a Zoom dweller for quite a while because I'm an academic and I collaborate. We need to be a global community but yet we shouldn't be traveling in airplanes so much, probably. But we need to not fray the kind of amazing like rhizomatic network of humans. Like part of what airplanes bought us is like there's so many people from all over who are here at Stanford. Like I've worked with people all over the world. Like that wasn't true when I was a young person for most people. So like I think part of our thinking about that has to be like, what does it afford or facilitate that we want to maintain like as kind of a human organism? Right, we've accustomed ourselves to this kind of like network of communication involves traveling. We need to stop doing that. So I think VR could be a part of that mix, right? And it could be a part of the mix, I think, for conferences have not solved mingling on Zoom, okay? And Zoom is not so great for subtle aside conversations and kind of gently broaching a topic. It's very hard-edged. So I think we may find that an immersive 3D environment is just more appropriate for certain kinds of conversations. And also, if we have things like the fireflies, it might just lighten a tough conversation. Like you might choose to have a conversation with a colleague who's remote and be like, let's really get into VR. I don't want to do this on Zoom. So I think you could see it as part of an ecosystem of tools. And we need to be very thoughtful about what are the affordances of each. How do we design affordances in to sort of support our humanity, if you will. One more here.
Yeah. I just have a question on like how like social games work. Do you feel like because of social games, people might get addicted to social games, and after that they don't know how to interact outside of virtual environments?
Yeah.
That's a problem nowadays, actually.
I think it really depends on the social game. A lot of people played Among Us during the pandemic. A lot of people played Animal Crossing. Those are both like casual, low, lightweight startup, but just really charming, really uplifting, really kind of just a balm to one's soul, right? But if you're talking about a persistent, hardcore, level up kind of intense play situation, and maybe you're talking about an adolescent who feels like the world is really overwhelming, like mastering that stuff is a hell of a lot more confusing in the real world than in the game. Gosh, I know when I'm better because I get these levels. Yeah, I think someone can get out of whack with that. I think we have to be wise about that. We have to say, okay, what is going on for this young person that this is so much more compelling to them? It probably has to do with being empowered and feeling like they know what the heck's going on and they're of value. So maybe we start there, right? Obviously, yeah, I mean, I think some business models, now that things have become services, it is way too enticing for companies to grab you for as much time as they can. And that's a societal level discussion, right? Where you may need regulation. It's like, nope, you can't design certain things. Like we regulate gambling machines because we know that they tweak people's brains in certain ways. Like I think, yeah, we've got to have those conversations. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Katherine. Can we give her a big round of applause?